Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here because today's story is a bit different from what we usually bring you on this channel. Most of the time when we sit down with someone to tell their story, there's a clear moment. A discovered message, a missing bank transfer, a face they weren't supposed to see. A villain, a twist. The kind of thing that makes you want to share the video and say, watch this, you won't believe what happened. This one doesn't have that. And honestly, that's what makes it harder to watch. Dermot Callahan is 54 years old. He's from Limerick in Ireland. He spent 25 years as a head chef, real kitchens, not television kitchens, and he arrived in Vietnam in March of 2023 with his eyes open, his savings accounted for, and what he genuinely believed was a realistic plan. He is not a naive man. He is not a romantic fool. He is someone who checked the numbers, read the forums, watched the videos like this one actually, and thought he understood what he was walking into. He was right about some of it. He was wrong about the parts that cost him. What Dermot lost in Vietnam wasn't his life savings. It wasn't his health. He didn't lose it all to a woman who was never real or a business that never existed. What he lost was quieter than that, and in some ways more instructive, because his mistakes are the ones most of you watching right now are either making or about to make. This one's going to stick with you, especially if you're already on that plane or if you're lying awake at 2 in the morning watching retirement videos and thinking, yeah, maybe Vietnam. Here's his story in his own words. You're right. So I'm going to start in a kitchen because that's where everything in my life starts, really. 5:30 in the morning, checking a prep list. That's my earliest memory of feeling useful. And it's also roughly the last place I felt like myself before everything went sideways. 25 years I worked in professional kitchens. Not the glamorous sort you see on the television with the shouting and the Michelin stars. Real kitchens. Adair Manor doing weddings for 400 people on a bank holiday Saturday. A pub in the city doing 150 covers on a Sunday carvery when the lamb hadn't arrived, and the head waitress had rung in sick. 8 months on the Cork to Roscoff ferry, which I mention not because it was important, but because it was the most physically miserable I've ever been in my professional life, and the passengers still complained the steak was overcooked. The Atlantic Ocean is trying to throw you into the sink, and the man in seat 42 wants his medium rare, and somehow you deliver it. That's the job. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly because what comes after might make me sound like a man who couldn't manage anything, and that's not true. I was good at the work. I ran tight kitchens. I had standards. What I was less good at, what nobody warned me about, nobody in 25 years of culinary training ever mentioned, was what happens to a man like that when the kitchen closes and he has to go home. The marriage to Chauvin lasted 18 years. There were good stretches. Long good stretches, actually. We had AOI first, then Clodagh 3 years later, and for a while the four of us were fine. More than fine. But kitchens aren't compatible with family life in the way that, say, an office job is. You miss birthdays. You miss Christmas dinners. You're there in the building, but you're not there, if you know what I mean. You're mentally still doing the prep list. Siobhan was patient about it for a long time. Then she wasn't. I don't entirely blame her. The divorce was finalized in 2021. She got the house in Castle Troy, a 3-bed semi we'd bought in 2007 for a mad price, because that's what you did in 2007. She got half my pension contributions, which hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. The pension being the one thing I'd been quietly proud of keeping up despite everything. So she got primary custody of the girls. I got a 1-bedroom flat above a Centra in Dooradoyle and a settlement that, after legal fees, left me with enough to make decisions but not enough to make bad ones. Or so I thought. The flat. I'll tell you something about that flat. Silence has a texture when you've spent 30 years in a loud kitchen. It's not peaceful, it sits on you. I'd come home at 11, midnight sometimes, and there was nothing. No voices from upstairs, no telly left on, no one needing a glass of water or a permission slip signed. I'd eaten alone more nights in that marriage than I cared to admit. But at least there'd been the noise of a family in the house. Now there was just me and the hum of the central refrigeration units through the floor. I did a year in Dublin after. Hotel work? Are the kind that pays well and takes everything from you. I told myself I was saving. I was. I was also not sleeping, not calling the girls enough, not doing anything except working and watching property prices and telling myself I was fine. I was 43 kinds of not fine. The Vietnam thing started at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in January of 2022. I was on my phone, which is never a good sign at that hour, watching one of those retirement abroad videos. You know the ones. Lads sitting by a pool somewhere warm with a beer, telling you what his rent is. I'd watched Thailand ones. I'd watched Portugal ones, which made me feel poor. I'd watched Mexico ones that scared me for different reasons. Vietnam kept coming up in the suggestions, and I kept skipping past it. And then one night, I didn't skip it. What got me wasn't the cost of living, though. That was part of it. It was that Vietnam felt like a real country, not a resort, not somewhere you went to sit by a pool and feel smug. The food alone. I watched 40 minutes about Vietnamese street food, and my professional brain completely overrode whatever rational concerns I had about moving to Southeast Asia at 53. You want to get a chef excited about relocating? Show him Bun Bo Hue and tell him a bowl costs 60 pence. Thailand I dismissed. Too many lads from Limerick already there. I'm serious. You go to Chiang Mai and you'll find someone from Dooradoyle telling you where the good trad sessions are. I wanted somewhere nobody knew me. Somewhere I wasn't the man who'd lost the house and the pension contributions and the girls. Somewhere I could just be a person for a while, without a history attached. I told myself 6 months. A trial, sensible, measured. I'd give it until September, and if it wasn't working, I'd come back and reassess. That was the story I told myself and anyone who asked. I believed about half of it. The other half was simpler and less flattering. I was running. Not from Vietnam toward anything in particular, but from Dooradoyle and the flat, and the silence and the version of myself that had managed to work himself out of his own marriage and into a life that felt like a waiting room. I was 53 years old and I had €78,000 in savings and a partial pension that was going to kick in early because my niece had finally filed a formal complaint, and I thought, if not now, when? I booked a one-way ticket on a Thursday afternoon. Ryanair to Dubai, Emirates the rest of the way. Flew out the 5th of March, 2023. I didn't tell the girls until I'd already booked it. That conversation with Awif was, well, she's the serious one. She had questions I didn't have answers to. Clodagh was warmer about it, which surprised me. Said it sounded like something I needed. She's 20 at this point and somehow already more perceptive about her father than he is about himself. There's something I'll say now that I couldn't have said at the time because I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. The girls weren't the reason I delayed going. They were the reason I finally went. If I stayed in Dooradoyle, I'd have kept being the embarrassing ghost of a father who lived 20 minutes away and rang irregularly and felt guilty about it constantly. I thought, and this sounds mad, but bear with me, I thought if I was 9,000 kilometers away, I might actually have to make the effort. That distance might turn obligation into something more like intention. That turned out to be one of the few things I was right about, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was on a plane, and for the first time in about 3 years, I slept. The thing nobody tells you about landing in Ho Chi Minh City is that the airport is the last ordinary thing you'll experience for about a week. You come out through arrivals and the heat hits you before you're even properly outside. Not warm, not Mediterranean holiday warm. I mean the kind of heat that has weight to it. Like someone's pressed a warm, damp cloth against your entire face and won't take it off. And it was 8 in the evening and still 32 degrees, and I was standing there with my 2 bags thinking, right, this is either going to be brilliant or I've made a catastrophic error. The taxi rank was bedlam. Drivers shouting, someone grabbing for my bag, not aggressively, just helpfully, but I didn't know the difference yet. And I'd read enough forum posts to know I needed a metered cab or I'd pay 4 times the going rate. I found one eventually. Sat in the back watching the city come at me through the window, and I genuinely couldn't process it. The motorbikes. I need to talk about the motorbikes. There are millions of them, and they move like a single organism, like a school of fish. And the first time you try to cross a road on foot, you just have to walk into the current and trust that it'll go around you. I didn't trust it for about 10 days. I stood on curbs for 10 days looking like an Egypt. I'd booked a guest house in Bin Tan for the first week. Nothing fancy, a room with a fan and a window that looked out onto a hem where someone cooked something brilliant smelling every morning at 6. That first night I lay on the bed and listened to the city. Motorbike horns and karaoke from somewhere close. A dog, a vendor calling out something I didn't understand. And underneath it all, just this constant low hum of 8 million people getting on with things. I slept better than I had in 2 years. The apartment hunt took about 10 days. I'd done my research, 8 to 12 million VND a month for something decent in Bintan. And that's what I was after. Nothing flash. Somewhere clean with reliable water and an air conditioning unit that actually worked, which is not a given. I found it through a Facebook expat group. A one-bedroom on a quiet street off Jinbo Lynn, third floor. Landlady named Ba Huang, who was approximately 70 years old, and communicated exclusively through her nephew Min, who was 17, and had a phone translation app in the confidence of someone who'd been doing this since he was 12. The negotiation was conducted entirely through Min's phone screen, and it took 45 minutes, which is how long it took me to stop trying to haggle and accept that 8 million Vietnamese dong, about €300 a month, was already a fair price, and she knew it, and I knew it, and Min definitely knew it. Grand, clean enough, smelled like tiger balm and the ghost of someone's cooking. Hot as a pizza oven, but I've worked in worse. I was proud of that apartment, genuinely proud, which probably tells you something about where I was mentally. But it felt like evidence that I wasn't an Egypt, that I'd done the work, that I wasn't one of those lads who rolls off the plane and pays Thao Jian prices for the privilege of living next to other foreigners. I was doing it properly, and for those first 2 months, I mostly was. I ate my way around the city like it was a professional assignment, which in my head it sort of was. I'd sit down somewhere, watch what came out of the kitchen, reverse engineer the flavors. There's a Boon Bo Hu place near the Vun Thon Bridge that I visited 4 times in the first month alone, just trying to understand what they were doing with the lemongrass. I ate 3 breakfasts most days, pho at a plastic stool spot on Lei Ban Sai, then banh mi from the woman on the corner who had maybe 12 ingredients, and a queue that started at 6:30. And then sometimes a bowl of chow from a cart near the market just because I could, and it cost 30 pence. A chef in Vietnam is a particular kind of happy. I was that. I explored without a plan, which I'd never done in my life. I walked until my knees complained, then got a grab bike and kept going. Ben Than Market, which is for tourists, but behind it there's a wet market that isn't, and that's where the real stuff is. The Jade Emperor Pagoda in District 3. The canal paths in Bin Than at dusk when everyone comes out on their motorbikes and the light goes gold. I was sleeping 8 hours a night. I hadn't slept 8 hours a night since 2015. I rang Awaf about 3 weeks in. It was awkward. She asked practical questions. Where was I living? How was the food? Was it safe? And I answered them, and there was a pause, and she said, okay, well, take care of yourself, da. Which is AOE fee for I love you, and I'm still worried. I rang Cloda a few days later, and she wanted to know everything. What I was eating, what it smelled like, had I met anyone interesting? And we talked for an hour. I need to ring more, I thought. I'll do better at that. I told myself that. The expat community found me before I went looking for it. There's a Facebook group, a big one, and once your name's on it, you start getting invited to things. Sunday sessions at various bars, a quiz night in District 2, a weekly breakfast meetup in a cafe on Nguyen Tien Thuat that had been running for about 6 years. I went to a few. You meet all sorts. There's a type, and I say this as someone who was briefly adjacent to the type, who's been here 5, 8, 10 years, and whose entire conversational range is warnings. Don't trust the landlords. Don't trust the visa agents. Don't trust the girls. Don't trust anything. They sit there with their Bia Saigon at 11 in the morning, and they'll give you a full seminar on every way Vietnam has wronged them. Every port has men like that. Men who hit the rocks and blame the sea. I wasn't unsympathetic. I just didn't want to become one. And then there were the others. Lads who'd been here 15 years and had families and businesses and Vietnamese that was actually fluent, and a comfort with the place that read as genuine rather than performed. They were quieter about it, less evangelical. When you asked them what the secret was, they tended to say things like, take your time, learn the language a bit. You don't make big financial decisions in the first year, sensible. The kind of advice that sounds obvious and isn't. About 6 weeks in, I was at a street food spot on Bui Thi Xuan, eating a banh mi on a plastic stool at 7 in the morning, watching the city come awake. The Café Sua Ja vendor across the road setting up her cart. A man in a conical hat cycling past with improbable quantities of baguette strapped to his rack. 3 motorbikes navigating around a sleeping dog with the casual precision of long practice. And I realized I hadn't thought about Siobhan in 4 days, hadn't thought about the flat above the Sentra, hadn't done the mental arithmetic of the divorce settlement or the custody arrangement or any of it. Just 4 days. But still, there was relief in that. Real relief. And underneath the relief, guilt about the relief, is because those 4 days included a Sunday when I hadn't rung the girls. Both things in the same moment, the lightness and the weight of it. I sat there with my bon me. This woman's pate was extraordinary, by the way. She must have had a ratio I couldn't crack, and I thought, right, okay, this might actually work. It was about 3 weeks after that when a mate from Limerick, Patrick, sent me a YouTube link, titled something like Secret Techniques of Vietnamese Home Cooking or similar. He'd sent it as a joke, knowing I'd be annoyed by the framing. And I was. I watched 12 minutes of it, and I was professionally offended. The knife work was, anyway, there was a cooking class mentioned in the description, run by actual Vietnamese cooks, District 1, not aimed at tourists exactly, more of a techniques workshop. I wasn't going to learn anything. I want to be clear about that. I was 30 years a chef, and I knew it. But my professional ego had been sitting idle since I'd arrived, and it needed something to assess and judge and quietly feel superior about. I booked the class. I wasn't going to meet anyone either. That also needs saying. I was there to prove a point about knife technique. I walked in on a Tuesday morning in early May, and there were 8 or 9 other people in the room, a mix of tourists and a couple of locals, and 2 instructors. One was a young man who barely looked at anyone. The other was a woman, maybe mid-30s, who was arranging ingredients on a prep bench with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and still cared about getting it right. That was Lynn. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't register her as anything other than an instructor for the first 20 minutes. I was too busy being annoyed about the mise en place. They'd set up the stations wrong. Wet ingredients too close to the dry aromatics, no logical flow for the workflow. I could see it immediately. I said nothing. I was a guest, not the head chef, but I noticed, and noticing gave me something to focus on besides the fact that I was the oldest person in the room by about 15 years and the only one who looked faintly ridiculous holding a cleaver. Lynn started with lemongrass. How to bruise it, how much to use, what it's doing in the dish versus what you might think it's doing. She explained it precisely, without fuss, and then she demonstrated and the whole room smelled incredible. You know, that sharp citrus note cutting through the humidity. Professionally, she was good. I noted that. And then she came around the stations to check the prep work, got to mine, looked at what I'd done and said, very quietly, not to embarrass me, that my crosscut on the galangal was too fine and would turn bitter in the broth before the other aromatics had developed. She was right. I'd been cutting European. Different timing, different result. I adjusted. I think about that moment. The fact that she was right, and the fact that she delivered the correction like a peer rather than a teacher. No performance of deference, no overcorrection in the opposite direction either. Just, here's the thing, here's why. The professional respect came first. Everything else came after. We had coffee after the class, her suggestion, which I hadn't expected. A place 2 streets away, one of those narrow shophouse spots where the Siafe Suajay comes in a glass the size of a thimble, and costs 15,000 VND and tastes like it was made by someone who has strong opinions about coffee and is right about all of them. She asked how long I'd been in Saigon. I said 2 months. She asked what I thought of the food. I said the Bun Bo Huo near the Vân Thon Bridge was doing something interesting with the shrimp paste ratio, and she laughed. Not politely, actually laughed, and said she knew exactly which place I meant, and she'd been trying to work out the same thing for 2 years. That was it. That was the beginning. Now. I'm going to be precise here because I think it matters. I was careful. I know how that sounds from a man who's going to tell you he lost nearly 18,000 euro over the next year and a half, but I was genuinely, deliberately careful in those first months. I'd heard the stories. I'd sat across from enough bitter lads at enough expat breakfast to have the pattern memorized. I wasn't going to be that, so I went slow. Coffee, then a meal, then a few more meals over the course of a month, always splitting or sometimes her paying, which she insisted on at least half the time. I asked questions about her life, her daughter, her work. She told me about Bao, 7 years old, living during the week with Lynn's mother in Da Nang, coming to Saigon on weekends when Lynn's schedule allowed. The girl's father wasn't in the picture. Lynn said this plainly, no drama around it, which I found, I don't know, grounded. She also did bookkeeping for a small restaurant group 3 days a week, the cooking classes the other two. She was busy. She had a life that didn't have a gap in it, shaped like a foreign man. I noticed that too. There was an evening in June, maybe 3 or 4 weeks in, when we'd taken a grab out to a Quan Nao her cousin had recommended in District 4. One of those places that's nothing from the outside and revelatory from the inside. Plastic tables crowded together, cold 333 beer, whole fish grilled over charcoal. We shared a taxi back and the driver overcharged, the classic tourist meter trick. And as I was fishing around for the cash, she'd already counted the change and handed back the overage. 200,000 Vietnamese dong, about €7.50, without ceremony, without commentary, just here, that's yours. I replayed that moment a lot in the months that followed. Used it as evidence. She's not like that, I'd tell people. And I'd point to the 200,000 Vietnamese dong as proof. Which, yes, but also, a person can be honest about €7.50 and still have a different understanding of what larger sums of money are for. Both things can be true, I know that now. The relationship became official, if that's the right word for two people in their 50s, around month 3, late July. She met me one afternoon at the Tao Dan Park near the cathedral, the one where old men play chess under the trees in the morning, and we sat on a bench, and it was the kind of conversation that doesn't need much said in it. We'd been circling for weeks. We both knew. I met Bao about 2 weeks after that, a Sunday. She arrived in Saigon on the overnight bus from Da Nang. 7 years old, shy as a cat in a new house, and she sat across from me in a Com Tam restaurant on Vo Vun Tan, and did not speak for 45 minutes. Then she noticed I was eating the broken rice wrong. Apparently there's a correct order of operations for eating Com Tam, and I'd violated it. And she very seriously corrected me through Lynn, pointing at each component in sequence. I followed her instructions. She seemed satisfied. By the end of the meal, she was showing me things on her mother's phone, a game she played, a video of a cat. I'm aware of what I'm describing here and what it looked like from the outside. A man who'd lost daily proximity to his own daughters, suddenly in the orbit of a 7-year-old who needed someone to teach him how to eat properly. I'm not going to pretend that wasn't part of it. It was. I didn't name it at the time, didn't want to look at it directly, but watching Lynn with Bao, the patient, low-key authority of it, the way she managed the child without drama or performance, I kept thinking about Awif and Clodagh at that age. Whether I'd ever been that present. Whether I'd noticed them the way Lynn noticed Bao? The answer was not reliably. And that sat on me. The spending in those first few months was, there's nothing remarkable to report, and that's the point. I covered dinners. I suggested a weekend in Vung Tau in August. The coast, a couple of nights, my idea entirely, nobody asked. And I paid for it because I'd suggested it, and I had the money, and it seemed normal. She was surprised, actually, said I didn't need to spend like that. Thought that was touching. I still think it was genuine. The total for August was maybe €800 covering the Vung Tau trip, a few nicer restaurants, a Grab account I topped up for her, ordinary things. September and October, similar. When her phone died in late September, screen cracked, unrepairable, I bought her a new one without being asked. 4.5 million Vietnamese dong, about €170. I'd have done that for anyone I was seeing. I didn't think twice. If I total it up, and eventually I did total it up very carefully in a notebook, but that comes later. The first 3 months of the relationship cost me roughly €2,200 beyond my own living expenses. Dinners, trips, the phone, small things. The kind of money you'd spend on a girlfriend anywhere in the world, and never think to categorize as a warning. I told a few of the expat lads about Lynn. I chose the ones who seemed less committed to cynicism. The reactions were still diplomatic. One of them, a Scot named Graham who'd been in Saigon 8 years and was by no means bitter, said to me, "Just take it slow with the family stuff." I said, "Of course." I meant it. "She's not like that," I told him. I know how it sounds. But she's actually not like that. He didn't argue. He just nodded and changed the subject, which in retrospect was a more precise response than anything he could have said. The call about Lynn's mother came on a Wednesday morning in late August. But I remember because I was in the middle of my second breakfast, a bowl of bun rio at a place on Huangdiu I'd been working up the courage to try for 2 weeks. And I looked at my phone and it was Lynn's name, and I answered it expecting ordinary conversation. She was calm. That's the first thing I'll say. She didn't cry, didn't dramatize. She told me her mother had been admitted to Ben VNC Jianang 2 days earlier with a gallbladder problem that had become acute. Surgery scheduled for that Friday. She'd been going to tell me sooner but hadn't wanted to worry me. She was telling me now because the bill had come, and and then she described it simply, just the number, 45 million Vietnamese dong, and went quiet. I'd met her mother once. A trip to Jianning in July, brief, a Sunday lunch at the family house, in which the mother, polite and watchful and serving food continuously in the way of a woman who shows love through feeding, which I understood immediately and found moving. 72 years old, worked hard her whole life. Unwell now. What was I going to do? Watch her not have the money? I'm not built like that. I said I'd transfer it that afternoon and I did. 45 million Vietnamese dong? About 1,700 euro? I didn't discuss it, didn't negotiate, didn't ask whether there were other options. I just sent it, the way you'd hold a door open for someone. Basic decency. And it was. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was the right thing to do, and I'd probably do it again. The surgery went fine. The mother recovered. I have the hospital paperwork somewhere because Lynn sent it to me. I think she understood without being asked. That I might want to see it. I did want to see it, which maybe tells you something about where my head was already. But the paperwork checked out. Real diagnosis, real hospital, real figures. Not a fabrication. Here's what I didn't understand. And this is the thing I want you to hear clearly if you're considering doing what I did. The moment I paid that bill, I stopped being Lynn's boyfriend. Not in her eyes, she still thought of me as her partner. Genuinely, I believe that. But in the family's eyes, in the wider social architecture of how things work, I became something else. I became the tie with money, the solution, the person you go to when there's a problem that requires funds. And this wasn't cynical. It wasn't calculated. It was as automatic and unremarked as the way a river finds the sea. The logic was, he has money. We need money. He cares about Lynn, therefore he'll help. Where was the manipulation in that? There wasn't any. It was just the assumption, the gravity of it. Nobody told me about it. Nobody sat me down and said, pay this bill, and your financial identity in this family will be fixed permanently. That's not how it works. It just works. I went from boyfriend to bank without a meeting being called about it. The requests that followed arrived at steady intervals over the next 3 months, and none of them were unreasonable on their own. I want to say that again. None of them were unreasonable. Lynn's younger brother Kai needed a motorbike. He was doing delivery work, couldn't do it without reliable transport. The public buses were impractical for his routes. 22 million Vietnamese dong. How at about 830 euro for a decent second-hand Honda. I'd seen him at the family house, a quiet lad in his mid-20s. No wasted words, working hard. Probably true he needed it. I paid. Bao's school fees came due in October. Quarterly payment, 18 million VND, roughly 680 euro. I was, in practical terms, a father figure to this child by now. She called me Chew Dermot. Uncle Dermot. She showed me cat videos on weekends and corrected my chopstick technique with the solemn authority of an expert. I wasn't going to not pay her school fees. I paid. Then Tet arrived. My first Vietnamese Lunar New Year. I want to give this the time it deserves because I think for a lot of Western men, this is the moment that separates theory from reality. And I wasn't ready for it. Lynn explained the Li Zi tradition, the red envelopes, the money given to family members, the way it works. Fine. I understood gift giving at major holidays. Ireland invented guilt-based gift economics. I prepared an envelope, 5 million Vietnamese dong, about 190 euro, which seemed meaningful to me. Respectful. Generous, even. Lynn's father, a man of 67 who'd worked construction his whole adult life and had the hands to prove it, a man I genuinely respected, accepted the envelope, looked at it, said nothing directly, and moved on. Afterwards, very quietly, Lynn told me he'd expected more. How much more? She mentioned a figure, I gave another 3 million Vietnamese dong. He accepted this also without acknowledgement. It wasn't the money. I want to say that plainly. 110 extra euro was nothing to me in the scheme of things. It was being told the amount I'd given had a grade. I hadn't known there was a test. I'd prepared what I thought was a generous gesture, and discovered that gestures here had calibrated expectations I didn't have access to. The scale existed. I just couldn't see it. I think about that moment sometimes. Lynn's father sitting there with the envelope saying nothing. It's the quietest thing in this whole story, and it's the thing that should have made me sit down with a piece of paper and do the arithmetic. I didn't. There was one other moment in those months that I replay more than the rest. Lynn's mother had a follow-up consultation in September, routine post-surgery check, and there were additional costs, smaller ones. Medication mostly, maybe another 300 euro over a few weeks. I paid without comment. But at some point in there I asked, carefully, very carefully, whether Kai might be able to contribute something toward the ongoing expenses. The motorbike was working well for him. He had income now. The silence that followed was delicate, not hostile, not defensive. Just a long, confused pause, and then Lynn said something about how Kai didn't earn enough to make a meaningful contribution. And then she moved on, and I let her move on, and I filed the moment under cultural difference and carried on. He probably didn't earn enough. That was probably true. But what I noticed and didn't speak aloud was that the question itself seemed not just unanswerable, but somehow wrongly shaped. Like I'd asked something that didn't fit the grammar of how the situation was understood. There were people who provided and people who received. I was in the first category. That wasn't a negotiation. And that was just the arrangement. If I total stage 2, the hospital bill, the motorbike, the school fees, the TET envelope, and the correction, the follow-up medications, it comes to somewhere around 7,400 euro over 3 months. Again, none of it enormous in isolation. Spread across a quarter, it barely registered against my savings. The pension payments were coming in monthly, about 900 euro, covering my basic living costs and Bien Than with some left over. I was spending from savings for the extras, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. That was the design of it, though not anyone's deliberate design. That was just how it accumulated. I was 8 months into Vietnam. 9,500 euro beyond my living costs, and a trip to Da Nang was being planned. A proper visit this time. Staying at the family house. Meeting everyone properly. I was looking forward to it, which sounds extraordinary given what I've just told you, but I was. I liked Lynn. I liked Bao. I admired the family's closeness and the way they functioned around each other. I didn't yet understand what the visit was going to show me, not about Lynn's intentions, but about the scale of what I'd walked into and what it was eventually going to ask of me. The roof I hadn't seen yet. That comes next. The family house in Da Nang was a 10-minute ride from Mai Kay Beach on the back of Kai's motorbike, the one I'd bought, which I noted without saying anything. 3 stories, narrow frontage, the kind of build you see everywhere in central Vietnam, terracotta tiles on the lower walls that had gone pale in the salt air. The neighborhood was residential, ordinary, washing lines strung between houses, a woman selling bun bo from a cart at the end of the lane. It wasn't poor, it wasn't comfortable. It was a family that had worked for what they had and maintained it with the effort that requires. I looked at the roof the moment we pulled up. Professional habit. You assess a building the way you assess a kitchen. Structure first, then surface. The roof had problems. I could see it from the street. Cracked tiles along the northern face, the flashing around the parapet showing rust staining down the render, one section near the front corner that had clearly been patched with something temporary that hadn't held. In Ireland, we'd have called it a job that needed doing. Here it was a job that had been waiting for someone with money to arrive. I didn't say any of this. I was a guest. The family lunch was the full event. Lynn's mother, recovered and formidable, had been cooking since 6 in the morning, and there was enough food for 8 people, and there were 5 of us. The father sat at the head of the table and was formally polite, in the way of a man assessing rather than welcoming, which I understood and didn't take personally. The younger sister, Thao, spoke some English and translated when the conversation outpaced Lynn's efforts, which was often. Kai was quiet throughout, ate efficiently, disappeared afterwards to do a delivery run. The altar in the corner of the main room had fresh fruit and incense, and a photograph of a grandparent, and the smell of the incense mixed with the fish sauce and the pork and something caramelized, and I thought, This is what a family home smells like. I'd forgotten. Lynn carried the whole household the way I used to carry a kitchen service. Every request went through her. When her mother needed something from the kitchen, when her father wanted his tea refreshed, when Thao had a question about plans, all of it directed at Lynn, resolved by Lynn, absorbed without complaint. She was the eldest daughter, the competent one, the one whose job it was to make things work. I found this admirable, I still do. It's also, I now understand, the context in which everything that followed made complete sense from her side. The roof came up on the second evening, not as a demand, not even as a request. More like Lynn showing me a problem the way you'd show someone a leaking tap. Here's the thing, it exists. It needs addressing eventually. She mentioned a builder's quote, 280 million Vietnamese dong, she said, about 10,500 euro. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the ceiling. I didn't respond immediately. I did what I always do when a number needs thinking about. I went quiet and ran it. 10,500 euro. Against my savings at that point, still north of 60,000, it was significant but not ruinous. Against the relationship, against the months I'd spent with his family, against the woman I was, and I'll use the word, the woman I was falling for, it felt like a reasonable thing a partner might do. Fix the roof. Solve the problem before it became a crisis. But something in me pulled back. I can't entirely explain it. 6,000 euro felt like a number I could defend to myself. 10.5 didn't. So I negotiated with myself over the following 2 weeks. Either the way I'd negotiate over a budget for a kitchen refit. What can I justify? What's the exposure? What's the exit if it goes wrong? And I settled on 6,000. I told Lynn I could contribute that amount, not the full cost. Half, roughly. She accepted this immediately without the back and forth I'd half expected, and I should have paid more attention to that. If you offer half of something and someone accepts without negotiating, it's possible they were expecting you to offer more. I wasn't thinking clearly enough to read it at the time. So that was 6,000 euro in November 2023. Running total now, 15,600 euro beyond living costs over 14 months. Still not catastrophic, still arguably defensible. Here's where I need to tell you about the visa situation. Because it was also November and I'd been ignoring it since August, which was stupid. Ireland had a 90-day visa exemption with Vietnam when I arrived. That meant tourist entry, 90 days. Extendable once with some paperwork for another 90. I'd done the extension. After that, the options were leave the country and re-enter, which resets the clock. Get a proper long-stay visa through a legitimate route, which requires either employment sponsorship or investment status, or join the fraternity of lads doing Cambodia runs every few months and hoping nothing changes in the regulations. I'd been doing the Cambodia runs. Phnom Penh for a weekend, back in on a fresh stamp. It worked. It was also roughly 300 euro a trip in transport and accommodation. Twice now, and it was not a plan. But it was procrastination with a departure board. I knew this. I'd known it since month 6. Every time I sat down to research the visa options properly, I found reasons to defer. The rules kept changing. The agents had varying reputations. The process was opaque enough that doing it wrong could cost more than waiting. So I waited. And at month 14, I was still waiting, which meant I had no legal certainty about my right to stay in the country I'd been living in for over a year. That's a mistake. I'll come back to it. The notebook started in December of 2023. A small one, a 6, the kind I used to use for kitchen ordering in the early days before everything went digital. I bought it from a stationery shop near Ben Than, and I started writing down every transfer, every payment, every time money left my account for something related to Lynn or her family. Not because I was suspicious, because I was a chef, and chef's mise en place. You know what you have before service starts. You don't run out of stock mid-dinner because you didn't check. The first complete page covered November and December. I looked at it for a long time. Not at the total, that came later, but at the frequency. There were 17 entries in 2 months. Most were small, a few hundred euro here and there. Another school fees payment for Bao, medication for the mother again, a contribution toward Thao's university registration, a grab top-up that became a monthly thing because Lynn's commute was long. 17 entries, none large enough to argue about, all of them perfectly reasonable in isolation. I'd never have run a kitchen like this. No prep list, no stock check. just spending into a void and hoping it balanced at the end of the month. The cafe proposal arrived in January of 2024, month 14. And I want to be honest, my first reaction was excitement. Lynn knew a woman, a friend from her restaurant group days, whose cousin had a commercial space available in Bintan. Ground floor on a decent street near Hoang Hoa Tam, not enormous but configured well. Proper ventilation, the kind of bones a kitchen person recognizes immediately as workable. The idea was a small cafe with food. Vietnamese primarily, simple menu, good coffee, the kind of place that serves the neighborhood rather than chasing tourists. Lynn knew hospitality. I knew kitchens. Between us, we had the skills to actually run it well, which is rarer than it sounds in the Saigon cafe landscape, where half the places are run by people who like the aesthetic and have never worked a service. I went to see the space twice. Brought a notebook, the financial one. Not the kitchen one, different purpose. And sat in the empty room sketching a rough menu and a layout and a costing for equipment. Counter, 2 commercial burners, espresso machine, cold storage, a small prep area in the back. I knew exactly what it needed. I felt for the first time in over a year, professionally useful in the way I understood. Not useful as a provider, useful as someone who knows what they're doing. The number floated was €18,000. Fit out, first quarter's rent, operating float. In Lynn's name, because, as I now understood from a year of reading expat forums and having half conversations about it, foreigners cannot hold that kind of commercial lease directly in Vietnam. The business would be hers legally. My contribution would be capital with no formal protection. I talked to a lawyer. Too late, but I talked to one. An expat barrister in District 2 who did consultations for foreigners navigating Vietnamese business law. He confirmed what I already half knew. No lease in my name, no formal equity stake, without a Vietnamese company structure which required its own investment and registration process, and even then enforcement of any informal arrangement was uncertain. He wasn't discouraging me, he was being accurate. The accuracy was discouraging enough on its own. I sat in the cafe space for the second time on a Tuesday morning in late February, menu sketches in front of me, notebook open. And I did the full arithmetic for the first time. Stage 1, 2,200. Stage 2, 7,400. Stage 3, 6,000 for the roof, plus the cumulative smaller payments through December, another 2,000. I total to date, €17,600 plus 18,000 for the cafe. €35,600 from a starting position of 78,000. I'm not going to tell you I panicked. I didn't panic. I sat there with the notebook and the menu sketches and I went very quiet, in the way I go quiet when a kitchen is about to go wrong and I can see it coming, and I'm deciding whether I have enough time to fix it before service starts. The professional in me, the man who'd checked stock levels and costed menus and managed budgets for 30 years, just looked at the numbers and said, no, not the relationship, not Lynn. The order. The order doesn't make sense. You don't approve this order. I closed the notebook. I sat for another few minutes in the empty cafe space, looking at the bones of what could have been a good kitchen. Then I went home and I thought about how to tell her. I want to be clear about something before I describe this conversation. You're watching this channel because you want the moment. The confrontation, the message on the phone, the second woman, the admission, the betrayal made visible and concrete. You want the villain scene because that's the shape a story is supposed to have. This one doesn't have that. And I've had to make peace with that because a story without a villain is harder to tell and harder to hear. It doesn't give you anywhere clean to put your feelings. I told Lynn I wouldn't be investing in the cafe on a Sunday evening in early March. We were in her apartment in Bin Tan, the one she'd had before we met. Small and tidy with a window fan that worked hard and a little altar on a shelf above the television. The usual offering, fruit and incense, and a small photograph. I'd been in that apartment hundreds of times. I knew where she kept the tea. I knew the sound the building made at night when the traffic thinned out. I said I'd been doing the numbers and I didn't think I could proceed with the cafe investment. I said I had concerns about the legal structure. No formal protection, no enforceable equity, money going into a business I couldn't own. I said this carefully because I'd rehearsed it, and I tried to make it sound like a practical problem rather than a verdict on anything else. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said she didn't understand. Not as a figure of speech. She genuinely didn't understand. She sat there with her tea, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been given information that doesn't compute. Not hurt, not calculating, just confused. The way you look when someone says something in a language you mostly speak, but a word you don't know has made the whole sentence unreachable. She said, "But you have the money." She said it plainly as a fact, not an accusation. I said, "Yes, I have the money, but the structure means I'd have no protection if anything went wrong between us." She said nothing would go wrong. I said I hoped not, but I needed the legal protection regardless. She said, "You don't trust me." I said it wasn't about trust, and I meant that. But I could see, watching her face, that for her those two sentences were identical. I don't trust the structure. I don't trust you. Same thing. Sarn, here's what I understood in that moment that I hadn't fully understood before. Not with my whole self. Not in a way that went all the way down. Lynn wasn't raised in a culture where money and love are separate considerations. In the world she grew up in the architecture of values that shaped her, that shaped her parents, that stretches back through generations of Vietnamese family life, a person who loves you provides for you. That's not a transaction. That's the expression of love. Her parents had sacrificed for her. She was sacrificing for her daughter, for her parents, for her siblings. A partner who could help and chose not to wasn't being prudent. He was, in the moral grammar she'd been raised inside, withholding. She wasn't looking at a man protecting his financial interests. She was looking at a man who claimed to love her and was refusing to act like it. One wasn't looking at a scammer. I was looking at a woman who'd been raised to believe that love and financial support were the same thing. They're not the same thing where I'm from. They're completely separate categories. But I was choosing to apply my categories to her life, and she was applying hers to mine, and neither of us was entirely wrong, and we were completely incompatible. She cried at some point in the middle of it, briefly without making it a performance, the way people cry when they're genuinely upset and don't particularly want to be. I didn't. I sat there, and I was sad in a very still, very contained way. The way I get sad when something I've been managing carefully finally stops being manageable. The conversation lasted about 2 hours, and nobody raised their voice. She asked me several times, in several different ways, whether the real problem was something else, whether I'd stopped caring about her, whether I'd met someone else, whether she'd done something wrong. And I kept trying to explain that it wasn't any of those things, that it was structural, that it was about incompatible understandings of what money and partnership meant, and she kept not quite reaching it, and I kept not quite reaching her. We arrived eventually at a silence that both of us understood. It wasn't angry. It was just the silence of two people who have been trying to find each other across a distance and have finally accepted they can't close it. It ended the way a long kitchen shift ends when the last customer has gone. Not with drama, just exhaustion, and when the quiet understanding that it's time to close up. I did the accounting afterwards in the notebook, the way you do a post-service debrief when something's gone wrong and you need to understand exactly what. Stage 1 through 4, minus the cafe. €17,800 over 18 months. Not a fortune. Not nothing either. About a quarter of what I'd arrived with. The visa situation was still unresolved. I had to fix that urgently and without Lynn, which meant paying a reputable agent properly, and finally, which I should have done at month 6. Add that to the list. I hadn't told Awife and Clodagh about Lynn. That was its own accounting. They'd been ringing more regularly. Besides both of them, the Sunday calls had become an actual thing by this point. And I'd said nothing about her, and now she was gone, and there was nothing to say. That felt dishonest in a way I couldn't quite name. The lads I'd told she's not like that. They'd never hear the full version. Some things you just carry. But this is what stays with me most, and it's not the money. 2 days after the conversation, I was going through my phone and I saw Bao's name. The contact I'd saved as Bao with a small star next to it, which I'd done one Sunday when she'd made me laugh so hard I'd nearly dropped the phone. 7 years old. The kid who'd taught me the correct way to eat Comtam and watched cat videos with the intense, critical attention of a film scholar. I couldn't call. She wasn't mine to call. I'd been Chew Dermot for 8 months, and now I was just a Thai who'd stopped coming round, and there would be no explanation given to her that would make any sense because How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the adults had incompatible theories of love? And I sat with that for a while. That one cost more than the 17,800 euro, considerably more. And it doesn't go in the notebook. I started looking at Ja Lot that same week. Somewhere cooler, somewhere cheaper, somewhere nobody knew me. Again. The same instinct that had brought me to Vietnam in the first place, and I'm not sure whether that's growth or just the same man making the same move. Maybe both. Maybe there isn't always a clean difference. Ja Lat is about 300 kilometers north of Saigon, up in the Central Highlands at roughly 1,500 meters altitude. And the first morning I woke up there, I needed a blanket. I hadn't needed a blanket since Ireland. I lay there for a moment, genuinely confused, and then I just laughed. The absurdity of it. Dermot Callahan, 54 years old, divorced, somewhat wiser and considerably poorer than he'd planned, lying in a bed in the Vietnamese highlands laughing at a blanket. The city is odd in the best way. Pine trees. Actual pine trees which shouldn't be there and are, lining the roads near the lake, and in the mist on certain mornings well, they look almost Irish. I'm not going to labor that point because it's a bit much, but there it is. The produce market on Nguyen Thi Minh Khai opens at 5 in the morning, and it's the most beautiful market I've encountered in nearly 2 years of professional-grade market attendance in this country. Strawberries grown locally, artichokes, persimmons in October with a color that would stop you in the street. I go every morning, and I have no practical reason to go in. I live in a one-bedroom apartment, and I'm not cooking professionally, but I'm a chef, and chefs go to markets, and after 18 months of everything being complicated and expensive and ambiguous, there is something deeply settling about standing in front of a table of well-grown vegetables and just looking at them. If anyone asks, that's my meditation practice. The apartment costs 6 million VND a month, 225 euro, less than Bin Thon, cooler than Bin Thon. My knees, which had been increasingly vocal about the Saigon humidity and the hard floors and the general insult of 54 years of accumulated bad decisions, have largely stopped complaining. I have roughly 54,000 euro left. The pension comes in every month, 900 or so, covering my basic costs with some leftover. I'm not comfortable. I'm not desperate. I'm doing what I came here to do, which is live simply in a warm country where the food is extraordinary and the cost of it won't bankrupt me. The visa I sorted in July, 2 months after leaving Saigon. A reputable agent, that's someone recommended by a British lad in the Ja Lot expat group who'd used him twice and vouched for him, walked me through an investor visa pathway that gave me proper long-stay status. It cost money and paperwork and about 6 weeks of my life, and I should have done it at month 6 in Saigon instead of month 20 in Ja Lat. That's on the list. The expat group here is smaller than Saigon and more eclectic. There's a Belgian ceramicist, 2 retired Australian teachers, there's a Canadian who runs a small guest house near the lake and argues about rugby with the conviction of someone who has never actually watched it. We have coffee on Tuesday mornings at a place near the Xuan Huang Lake, where the Si Pei Suaja is served in old jam jars for reasons nobody has explained. When Munster are playing, I stream it on my laptop at 2 in the morning, and inevitably end up in an argument on Zalo with the Canadian about whether Ronan O'Gara or Johnny Sexton was the better out half, a question which has a correct answer that I know and he refuses to accept. I ring Aoif every Sunday. Both of them, Aoif and Clodagh, both. Without fail since June. Aoif still asks practical questions, still worries in her quiet, organized way, and I answer everything now instead of deflecting. Clodagh sends me voice notes about her week and makes me laugh regularly. I'm more present in their lives from 9,000 kilometers away in the Vietnamese highlands than I managed to be from across Limerick. And I've spent some time thinking about what that means and what it says about proximity and obligation, and the particular paralysis that settles on you when you're ashamed of yourself in a place where everyone can see it. I don't have a clean answer. But the calls are real, and they happen. And that's more than I could say 3 years ago. Now, you're watching this video for the mistakes. So let me give them to you directly. The first one is money, and it's the simplest. I had one pot. Living money, relationship money, family obligation money, all came from the same account, which meant there was no firewall and no alarm. The moment I started spending on someone else's needs from my savings, Those savings started to meaning something different and I couldn't see it because there was no separation. If you're coming here to retire, open two accounts before you get into a relationship. One for living, one for everything else. Keep 2 months' living expenses in the first account and treat it as untouchable. Not because Vietnamese women are thieves, because you need to know what you're spending and on what, and mixing it all together makes that impossible. The second mistake is the visa, and I've covered this. I deferred and was technically on borrowed time for over a year. If the visa situation had forced me out of the country at the wrong moment, with money already committed, and a relationship mid-complication, it would have been catastrophic. Insert the visa at month 6, not month 14, not after the cafe conversation. Month 6. The third is the lawyer. I talked to a lawyer about the cafe and he saved me from a bad decision. I should have talked to a lawyer at month 6 as well, not to protect myself from Lynn specifically because at month 6 I had no reason to suspect anything, but to understand my rights and exposure in general. What can a foreigner own here? What can't they own? What are the property and lease rules? What happens to money you put into a business in someone else's name? I found out most of this the hard way. A 2-hour consultation with a reputable expat lawyer in Saigon costs maybe €100. Do it before you need it. The fourth is the one that costs the most to say, honestly, I came here with a framework. The framework was there are scammers and there are genuine people. And if I'm careful enough, I can tell the difference and protect myself from the former while enjoying the company of the latter. That framework is wrong. Or rather, it's too simple. Lynn wasn't a scammer. She was a woman from a culture with a completely different and deeply held set of beliefs about what love requires of people. And those beliefs were incompatible with mine. And neither of us fully understood that until it was expensive. I wasn't deceived. I was oblivious is the word, I think. I chose to move into a society with rules I hadn't learned, and I paid for the gap in my education. That's different from being conned. It still costs the same. The fifth mistake is the one you're making right now if you've got this far and you're feeling relieved. You're watching a video titled Worst Vietnam Retirement Mistakes, and you've listened for 20 minutes and you're thinking, right, so if I just avoid those specific things, I'll be fine. The YouTube retirement picture, this channel included, I'm aware of the irony, shows you a best-case scenario. The smiling lad by the pool with the cold beer is real. He exists. The cost of living is genuinely low. The food is genuinely extraordinary. The weather is genuinely warm. All of that is true. What the thumbnail doesn't show you is the 2 in the morning loneliness when the novelty has worn off and you're 9,000 kilometers from your daughters and you've just ended something real and complicated and you don't entirely know what you're for. That's also real. Budget for it. Not financially, just know it's coming. And the sixth thing, so I'm the last one. I'm still here. That surprises people when I say it. They expect the story to end with the flight home, the cautionary lesson, the man who came and failed and left. But I didn't leave. I moved 300 kilometers north and found a produce market in a small circle of people who argue about rugby in a city that sits in the mist on certain mornings, looking almost like somewhere I used to know. Vietnam didn't break me. I came already broken, and Vietnam, even the €17,800 of it, even the loss of Bao's contact with the small star next to it in my phone, gave me something back that I hadn't expected. The retirement dream is real. The cost of living is real. The lifestyle is real. What nobody tells you on the YouTube videos is that you don't arrive into a vacuum. That you arrive into a society with its own rules about money and family and what a man is supposed to do. And those rules aren't wrong necessarily. They're just not yours. Know the difference before you open your wallet because once you've opened it, you're already in the negotiation. You just don't know it yet. The YouTube version of retirement shows you the beach. What it doesn't show you is who you are when nobody's watching, and whether that person can be happy. Vietnam made me find out. I'm still finding out. But the market opens at 5 and the strawberries are in season, and my knees don't hurt. And for a 54-year-old man from Limerick with a complicated recent history, that's a reasonable place to be. That's Dermot Callahan. Still in Vietnam, still at the market, still arguing about Johnny Sexton. We want to be honest with you about this story because it's one of the more difficult ones we've brought you on Inside Vietnam. There's no villain here. And Lynn wasn't running a scam. The family obligations were real. The love, such as it was probably real in its way. What happened was a collision between two people who came from entirely different moral architectures, different understandings of what money means, what family requires, what a partner is obligated to provide, and neither of them fully understood the distance between those architectures until they'd spent 18 months and nearly €18,000 trying to close it. Filial piety is not a scam. We want to say that clearly and mean it. It is a genuine, centuries-deep moral obligation that runs through Vietnamese culture. The expectation that children support parents, that family members carry each other, that the eldest daughter in particular is the linchpin of her household's welfare. Now, Western men who enter relationships without understanding this are not being deceived. They are being oblivious to a culture they chose to move into. The responsibility for that obliviousness sits with them, not with the Vietnamese women who simply live according to the values they were raised with. If you take 3 practical things from Dermot's story, take these. First, consult an expat lawyer before month 6. Not because you're in danger, but because you need to understand the legal landscape before you're emotionally invested in a decision that depends on it. Second, keep a separate emergency fund that relationships cannot touch, not as a statement of distrust, but as basic financial hygiene. Third, find a reputable visa agent before you need one. Not after you've been living in a country for over a year on tourist entries and hoping nothing changes. And if you're watching this, and you're already in month 5 of a relationship, and you've told everyone she's not like that, Dermot said that too. He was half right. The question is, which half? We're inside Vietnam. If this story helped you, subscribe. There are more here, some darker than this, some with cleaner endings, all of them true in the ways that matter. Next week, we're sitting down with a 61-year-old retired electrician from Perth who built a house in the Mekong Delta on land he thought he owned. That one has a villain. This was the harder kind. See you then.